I'm Joseph with 5 Deck Studio. Let's get into it.
The bed is going to be a pretty simple design. First, I have to cut down the side rails here. Then I'm going to have to cut down these connection rails here. That's probably not the correct terminology for these things, but we're just going to roll with it. For the side rails, I'm going to go ahead and cut down two 2x4s. In my case, I'm going to be cutting them to 79.5 inches. Once I had the side railings cut down, I could figure out the placement for the connection rails, and at this time determine how many connection rails I was actually going to need. I'm going to need 6 2x4s cut down to 55.5 inches. The full width of the bed is 60 inches, but each 2x4 is 1.5 inches. So I need to account for that thickness as well as the trim. More on that trim business later. I went ahead and transferred my marks from the top of the wood to the side of the wood. This will help me mark and locate the screw holes that I'm going to pre-drill to avoid any wood splitting. I also made sure that I went ahead and drilled some countersink holes, as I wanted to make sure that the trim would sit flush with the 2x4s. Now that all the wood is cut to size and prepped for success, all I need to do was join them together with some 3.5-inch screws. Once I'm done with my master bedroom, I can then address the need for a larger assembly table. But for now, you're gonna have to just watch me stumble my way through this build.
Next, we're gonna go ahead and make the legs for this bed. I'm gonna try to make this faux big giant block of wood look. I don't know how it's gonna go. I don't know if it's gonna work, but we're gonna try it. We're pretty much just gonna glue all these boards together and stack them up. Well, not these, I gotta go cut some more down. And then we'll go ahead and glue them together and we'll see how it looks in the end.
I must really like repetitive tasks, as making these legs was pretty much the definition of that. For the overall size of the faux block, we decided that stacking the 2x4s 3x3 was the best layout for us, which came out to 4.5 inches tall and about 10 inches wide. So for one leg, I'm gonna need 7 16-inch 2x4s. Then I'm gonna need an additional 4 small cutoffs to fill in the rest of the block. I made mine 4 inches so I could use as much of the offcuts as possible, as well as having to cut into 4 new 2x4s. Okay, back to some more repetitive tasks. I decided on the fly to remove the slight roundovers on the 2x4s, as this is going to make it a lot easier to glue up. Speaking of the glue up, I'm about to do this in 2 phases. I only need to glue up the first row and let that cure, as I'm going to glue and screw the rest of the blocks together. Once the first row glue was cured a bit, I went ahead and built my faux block. I used 2-inch drywall screws and glue to join everything together, but you could just use glue. I just didn't want to wait for the glue to cure enough to move on to the next step. Rather than do a bunch of sanding, I decided to use the table saw to flush up the sides of the faux blocks. The plan was to make these faux blocks and use a router to round over all the edges, but a thought came to me. Maybe it would look better with some random cut bevels. Those are words that I thought I would never say. Please forgive me, roundover gang. I went about setting my table saw to just random angles and just making a bunch of cuts. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have cut any deep bevels on the top of the faux blocks where the bed frame is going to rest on the legs, but I didn't have any issues with this, so mistake avoided.
All right, if I'm editing this correctly, you just saw me cut a bunch of these angles randomly on the table saw, and now I'm gonna go ahead and cut more random angles, but here on the miter saw. I don't know really what I'm aiming for. I'm just hoping it looks good afterwards. So let's continue.
When cutting all these angles, I made sure to pay attention to where I put those screws from earlier, because cutting into them would have been bad. Then I went ahead and slathered some wood filler on this thing like marmalade jelly. That reference was for all you DC Talk fans out there. The filler isn't a necessary step, but I decided I didn't want any gaps to show, so I went ahead and did it. Now I could go ahead and sand off all of the filler and smooth out any sharp corners on the blocks. Once everything was sanded up to 220 grit, I could go ahead and add 2 coats of water-based poly to the legs. Well, the wife could. I have to say, I really like how these legs came out. I know I probably can't be the first person to do this and attach these type of legs to a bed, but I think it's a pretty great idea. And it's now something I'm going to incorporate into the rest of this bedroom makeover. Now we can go ahead and make the frame not look like what it is. A bunch of 2x4s screwed together. My plan was to just make a bed frame that was the size of the bed and then attach some 2x4s on the sides, prime it and paint it and be done, just like I did with my son's bed. But in hindsight, I don't like how much his bed sticks out, so I decided 3/4 of an inch would be the best option for this bed. But then I also decided I wanted to be able to take this bed apart in the future if necessary. So the plan I came up with is to glue together two 3/4 inch thick boards like this. We'll call this piece the connection trim and call this piece the face trim. If you spotted that error, good on you. We'll discuss that more later. I decided to use MDF for my face trim, so I went ahead and purchased a full 4x8 sheet. I did this as I plan to use the leftover MDF to make a new workbench in the future. If you were building this bed, which would be awesome and kind of amazing, make sure to let me know how it goes. And second, you could just buy 3 1x6s in place of MDF. In this video, I'm only going to include the cost of 1/3 of the MDF. I cut the MDF into 3 15-inch wide strips on my table saw. For the connection trim, I had these 1x4s I glued up for a previous project like a year ago that I never ended up using, so I'm just gonna cut them down now because I didn't want to go to the store. For reasons I don't understand, I don't have any footage of me cutting down the side trim on the miter saw, or of the front trim or the end of the bed trim, whichever one you want to call it. In addition to the glue, I also added some 1¼ inch screws to connect the trim pieces. But this could be skipped and just clamped together. Now for my favorite part of any build, roundovers. Wait a second, let's slow that down a bit. Oh yeah. And that's quickly followed by my nemesis, sanding. But let's not let sanding kill our mojo. We have a mistake in not planning this build out to do that.
All right, when cutting these pieces and routing them and sanding them, I kind of realized my design error that I made here. This 1x4 should not be visible, especially from the top. You're gonna see the 1x4 and a gap, which is not ideal. So I'm going to have to cut, what is this, about 1.5 inches off of this 1x4 and remove it from the MDF and do the same thing on the bottom.
Thankfully, I realized this error before painting and trying to install the trim. A pole saw and a chisel made quick work of this problem. Now everything fits like it's supposed to. I love it when a lack of planning comes together. Now it's time to prime everything with a shellac primer, as I find this to be the best primer for MDF. So this could really drive up the cost of the bed. A gallon of bin shellac primer costs about $75 currently in this economy. I already had some on hand as I made all of the baseboard and trim when remodeling this house. I'm going to go ahead and cop out here and not include that full price in the cost of this bed, and I'll talk more about that later in the video. So the paint we're using we also already had. We bought this paint back in Oregon before we decided to move to Texas, and it was originally planned to be our kitchen cabinet paint. Right now this looks like a real light green, but I promise it will darken up. And we end up doing 3 coats, so it gets pretty dark in the end. We didn't use that much paint for this frame as the surface area isn't that large. The cost here really is going to depend on the type of finish you're using on the bed trim. For us, it cost about $5.
Next, we're gonna go ahead and switch to the headboard. And for the headboard, I'm trying to become the OSB furniture king here on YouTube. I mean, not really, but also yes. Yes, I am. So we had a lot of ideas when it came to the headboard, and everything involved OSB. I mean, is that a shock at this point? I mean, have you seen our wall?
I trimmed up the OSB boards outside as I was not going to try this on my table saw. We needed to remove the tongue off of the tongue and groove OSB board. Once I moved the OSB inside, I went ahead and tried to use some isopropyl alcohol to try to remove as much of the black stamp as possible. Then I went ahead and added the same roundovers as I did the bed frame trim for continuity. And then I went ahead and sanded the OSB up to 320 grit. Then I went ahead and applied about 6 coats of water-based poly, as we don't exactly want splinters from our headboard. One last thing we needed to do was cut down a 1x4 to make a French cleat. Then we could go ahead and attach it with some more 1¼ inch screws from earlier. We also added another 1x4 cut in half to attach as wall risers. At least I think that's what they're called. Now it's time to attach the other half of the French cleat to the wall. Like always, we use magnets and a level to locate the studs, and we made sure to pre-drill the holes before screwing the French cleat to the wall to avoid split out. And we used the same 3.5-inch screws that we used from earlier. Once the cleat was attached, we could go ahead and bring in the 8-foot sheet of OSB and hang it on the wall, and then position it to the wife's liking.
All right, let's go ahead now and put the bed together.
First, we put on some gripper type felt pads on the bottom of the legs to protect the floor and such. Then it was time to move everything into almost position so we could go ahead and attach the bed frame trim. I could have used threaded inserts here, but I wanted to go the faster route, and I just used 2-inch drywall screws from earlier, as this is a mostly 2x4 bed, so there's no need to get fancy now. Now we need to go ahead and secure the legs. I thought about using pocket holes, but I hate drilling pocket holes, so I went to my shop and found these 8 small cutoffs from this build and just drilled some holes in them off camera to act as some hold down blocks. And then I went ahead and attached them with some more 2-inch drywall screws. I had to go back to my miter saw one more time to cut down the slats that I'm using in this bed. In total, I cut down 9 1x4s to roughly 79.5 inches. Then I attached them to the bed frame with those same 1.25-inch screws from earlier, as some of the boards had a not so slight twist to them. And there it is, my DIY bed.
Now that we're done with the final shots, let's go ahead and break down the total cost of making this bed.
In total for this bed, I used 12 2x4s at a total cost of $52.32. 12 1x4 at a total cost of $40.56. I used 3 different types of screws at a total cost of $24.94. Of the MDF that I used, that total cost came to $19.33. For other supplies, the total came out to $18.46, but let's go ahead and round that up to just $20, as this will include paint, primer, glue, wood filler that I actually used on this project, as well as any sandpaper. I think that, with also me including the full price of screws, which I didn't use all of, will equal out to the actual cost that it would make to make this bed with those other supplies. So that brings the total cost for this bed frame alone to $157.15, which also doesn't clearly include sales tax. Now for the headboard, I bought a 23 and 32 inch sheet of OSB that came out to $17.98. I pretty much used the whole entire can of polyurethane, which was $25.98. I ended up using 2 1x4s that came in at a total cost of $6.76. And for any other supplies such as sandpaper and rollers, I just rounded that up to $5. That gives me a total cost for the headboard of $55.72, bringing my all-in cost for this bed to $212.87, or just rounding up, $213.
I wasn't trying to build the cheapest bed I could, but $213 roughly is not too bad for a custom bed. In all, it took me about 4.5 working days to build this bed and headboard, and about 1 to 2 days to let the paint and sealer cure before we could install. That's all we have for today. Come back and join us next week as we build a TV stand for our room that doesn't actually hold a TV, as the TV is mounted to the wall. Yeah, bye. Okay, let's put the bed. Okay, let's put the bed. All right, let's put the bed together. Wow, that was really hard to say from my mouth. All right, let's put the bed together. All right, now we can put the bed together. Why am I having a hard time saying bed?
I have no idea.
All right, now we can go ahead and put the bed together.
No.
Now we can go ahead and put the bed together. Bed together. Bed together.